Notions Outgrown by Norman Goodwin. Chapter 1. The crew was somewhere near the coast of Iran when Rusty raced to assume the midnight watch. It had been 90 days since the ship's last port call in Egypt, and the Parisian Gulf seascapes replaced those of the fabled Red Sea. Long strides carried Rusty through the lower deck to relieve the forward lookout. Exiting the watertight door, he emerged topside, peering to a moonlit night, an evening soddened by bright salt spray, chilled winds, and indigo starlight. Rusty stood on the weathered deck, gripping the cold, iron life rail. Thinking to adjust his eyes, he waited as the dim outlines of the ship's metal hull faded into view, developing like a fresh Polaroid. Darkened ship condition meant no white light emanated from the destroyer's interior, preventing vessels from spotting the nocturnal ship. The cosmic explosion of 1 trillion stars peppered the light sky, and their glow cast a soft, omnidirectional aura, making the world seem more expansive. With starlight, there were no shadows to constrain objects. Therefore, everything seemed larger from the silver light of countless celestial bodies. Being topside was dangerous enough, but walking on the bow could be fatal. Under the right conditions, if the wind didn't carry a sailor overboard, a rogue wave could. However, the choice was never up to Rusty, as life burdened him with duty not of his own volition. Punctuality was a collective obsession instilled in everyone since birth, and no one showed more devotion to meeting at an appointed time and space than a watchstander waiting to be relieved. Rusty had better not be late, or Connolly would have his ass reported. With a bounce and a shrug, Rusty's mechanic coat rode higher on his shoulders, and the seafarer found the new looseness of his sleeves more agreeable. He stuffed his thermos under his arm and slid his hands into the deep coat pockets, psyching himself up for the extremes ahead. Pulling his elbows close, he stepped onto the fossil. The large 100-foot-long bullet-shaped deck held the VLS Tomahawk missile launcher and the Mark 45 cannon turret. Dark silhouettes from these weapons of mass destruction helped the unsteady sailor chart his way through the veiled darkness. Strong winds swept across the deck. His hands shivered as he removed his hat to comb wavering fingers through his dark, sandy-colored hair. After surveying the scene, he placed his white cap back on his head and sighed, cursing in defiance of the bracing wind. This is bullshit. The swash of the ship's stem slicing its way through the ocean's wake mixed with the howling gusts created an audible white noise that seemed to originate everywhere. The ship's pitching motions were stronger on the bow than at the midship. Turbulent seas heaved, but not as hard as the largest oceans he'd sailed, and any sailor would attest that the Arabian Gulf was far less hostile than the aerated seas of the North Atlantic. The mild conditions Rusty faced this night were only a minor annoyance. Like a drunken sailor, Rusty staggered his way around the various obstacles laid out on the fossil. He placed purposed steps on the deck, one foot in front of the other, taking nothing for granted when the cost of a mistake exceeded the value of his life. When the ship slid down the backside of massive swells, it felt like she would pull herself from under his feet, tossing Rusty into places far worse than a rough deck. If Rusty tripped, the non-skid floor would shred his palms. And what would he do on a 4-hour watch with shredded, blood-caked palms? He slalomed the large missile launcher and the tall mount of the forward cannon before approaching the nose on the massive warship, stopping 10 feet behind Petty Officer Connolly. Facing oncoming winds, Connolly stared at the open waters, oblivious to Rusty's presence as he clocked the sea for mines. Rusty cupped his hands and raised them to his mouth, amplifying his voice over the boisterous groan of the elements. "Hey!" he shouted. Connolly turned to Rusty, but said nothing. Large, oversized night vision goggles weighed his head down, exaggerating his movements with jerky imprecision. His sluggish hands fumbled with his cord as he climbed down from his chair, gripping the handrails to aid his descent from the towering seat. The tall chair resembled an airboat seat or a lifeguard station on a busy beach. The only way to get to the tower was via a ladder, which was welded to the deck. It was a sturdy tower, even though it was not a permanent fixture. Sailors could rest easy knowing that it would not break off during rough seas. With his feet planted on the deck, Connolly lifted his goggles, eager to hand them to Rusty. Connolly's clumsy fingers dropped the sound-powered phone, but he snagged the cord before the earpiece connected with the deck. After situating himself, the tired sailor stood half-assed erect and raised his chin to meet Rusty's gaze. Rusty saluted the watchman. "I'm here to relieve you." Connolly returned the salute with his elbow held low. "I stand relieved." With his other hand, he cradled the large clump of electronic components, and soon it would be Rusty's turn to babysit the laughable bundle of gear. "Cold?" Rusty asked. "Freezing my ass off." Marching in place, Connolly looked past Rusty's shoulder, staring at the ship's superstructure. "Who's on the bridge?" Rusty asked. Connolly stopped stomping to better answer Rusty. "Chief Gilmore." "All right. Thanks. Oh, and I saw some mid-rats in the mess hall." Rusty was in no hurry to assume the watch, and he figured involving Connolly in the conversation would make the 4-hour shift go by faster. "What is it?" Connolly asked. He started marching again. "Roast beef?" Connolly sighed, tilting his head back. Again? We have roast beef every night." "I think it's real beef this time." "No thanks. I'll wait till breakfast." "Catch you later." Connolly handed the night vision goggles and sound-powered phones to Rusty before hobbling toward the ship's structure. Connolly failed to swing his arms or bend his knees. His gait was off and he moved like a wooden nutcracker. Although he willed his body to move, his muscles refused to comply with his mind's request. "The wind froze the poor bastard stiff." Tapped out as he was, the wary shipmate made his way around the tall gun turret and entered the same door Rusty had exited. Rusty sighed and turned, looking in the direction the ship sailed to conduct a quick situational analysis of his surroundings. Starlight reflected on the ocean's uneven surface, hinting at tranquil seas which were not as rough as he'd assumed. The swells ran at a 3 to 4 foot chop, and the ship's speed was 35 knots. The USS John Adams hauled ass, and Rusty was not about to become a new hood ornament. 8,000 tons of steel pitched up and down on an endless loop. With each wave, Rusty's weight alternated from heavy to light as her massive nose seesawed in a calming rhythm. The soothing pitch was more likely to lull Rusty to sleep than toss him overboard, and if it were not the chilly wind, Rusty would fall asleep, sitting in the chair. Snoozing in a cushy bed was great, whereas dozing on the forward lookout would be fatal. To fall asleep and land in the ocean, only to have the fast-moving Navy destroyer run you over, under, and through the screws would be a damn tragedy. He climbed the ladder and sat on the seat. A few minutes of exposure to the brisk night air already cooled the metal of the atmospheric ambient temperature. It wouldn't be long before Rusty's rear grew numb. The 3x3 foot piece of sheet metal was hard, flat, and smooth like polished stainless steel. Engineers cut the slippery sheet too wide to be called a seat in any actual sense of the word. Rusty resembled a toddler on a patio chair, and the armrests were too far apart, preventing him from resting both arms at the same time. It lacked safety straps to keep the sailor from coasting straight into the water. Hell, the only safety device Rusty had was his grip on the armrest and the minuscule friction of his denim pants. Had the engineer not welded the footrest to the proper height, Rusty would have been able to swing his legs. Rusty folded and stowed his hat in his back pocket before prepping his night vision goggles. With the straps adjusted and secured, he donned the sound-powered phones. They gripped like a pair of traditional headphones, except for a strap-mounted microphone that hung around his neck, positioning its diaphragm near his mouth. A quick look at the ocean revealed merchant ships sailing on the horizon, casting faint glows like distant green cities as viewed from the rural outskirts of any Midwestern town back home. Rolling green clouds littered the sky, obscuring large swaths of bright stars. Although he stood mine watch for weeks, the unobstructive view of the ocean and its vast openness still unnerved him. Rusty's watch had begun. He fumbled for a tiny button on the glossy black microphone. "Pilot house, mine watch, manned and ready," Rusty said. The officer of the deck replied over the headset. "Mine watch, pilot house. Very well." Rusty glanced over his shoulders. The scale of the ship's superstructure seemed odd. The massive structure appeared small and distant. Its long bow dwarfed the ship's primary structure, making the deck above the hull look too small by comparison. From his vantage point, it seemed Rusty was overextended, pushed forward to the farthest point of the bow. With snuffed panic, he turned his face back into the endless inflow of oncoming headwinds. Hood ornaments indeed. A fishy odor of salted jelly, polyps, and plankton embedded itself in the lining of his nose. Rusty licked his lips, and salt melted on the tip of his tongue. He peered through the night vision goggles, squinting at its bright green LED display. It took time for him to acclimate to their obnoxious light. When sailing at sea, the ocean extended to greet the horizon in all directions, whereas visiting the beach during summer vacation only provided half of the experience. The landlocked feeling from a day at the beach did not compare to the openness of being underway in the middle of the naked ocean, and nothing could ever compare to flying on the front end of a fast-moving ship. Rusty's primary duty was to spot mines. He was a lookout, tasked with locating hazards placed on the ship's path. The situation was absurd because although he had never seen a photograph of a mine, if he saw anything resembling one, he was to report its range and bearing to the sea officer of the deck standing watch on the bridge. If a floating bomb endangered the ship, it was to be destroyed. Rusty gripped his thermos between his legs and unscrewed the lid. Steam rose as he poured coffee into the lid. Even in a heavy wind, the savory aroma of blueberries filled the air as he lifted his cup and sipped the hot beverage, relishing the small pleasure it brought. The helmsman turned to port, forcing the ship to lean precipitously. Rusty seized the rail in one hand, eyeing his coffee cup in the other, all the while hoping that it would not spill. He remained in his fixed position for the duration of the maneuver. Once the ship righted herself, he downed the cup of coffee and secured the half-filled thermos inside of his coat, fearing another random course correction might surprise him. Frontal wind speed increased with the ship's new heading. Rusty clenched his coat breast, taking up the garment's slack, pulling the fabric tighter around the chest, bringing his warm thermos closer to his body. With his free hand, he flipped the collar to shelter his neck. With 4 hours until the relief showed, Rusty did his best to settle in for the long shift ahead. In 12 minutes, it'll be my birthday. Of all the ways that I could imagine spending my 21st birthday, seated on mine watch in the Persian Gulf was one scenario I never expected. Saddening nostalgia overcame Rusty. What are my friends doing for their birthdays? Halfway through his watch, as most bored people do, Rusty contemplated the mundane nature of his situation. What does a mine look like? A ball with flat protrusions or spikes? Do they float or are they submerged? How could someone spot a submerged mine if the mine is underwater? The sea's wake mirrored the vibrating reflection of a billion stars, from the brightest to the faintest. Rusty's eyes traced the dense band of the Milky Way that swept across the sky before fixating his stare on the constellation of Orion and Orion's top right shoulder, Betelgeuse. He scanned the sky for more familiar patterns, testing his ability to identify other constellations and celestial bodies, but he could only name a few. The billions of years the universe took to develop and the random emergence of intelligent life seemed paradoxical to the truth of human existence. How could the universe and all its beauty constrain the shortness of a person's existence? It wasn't right that life was so short on the universal scale. At 2:45 a.m., loud slapping sounds interrupted the monotonous rumble of the ship's splashing, pulling Rusty from his trance state. He jerked his head to the right, expecting a sea monster to emerge and drag him to his death, or a missed hazard seconds away from blowing the ship in half. However, reality offered something far more interesting than anything Rusty could imagine from his limited experience. At first, the slapping sounded like a jumping fish, but their pitch was much deeper, much lower, and much larger. His focused attention made the sounds seem louder. Decisive strikes on the ocean punctuated a series of rapid clicking noise. The commotion originated from the starboard side, at his 3 o'clock position just below his tower. He looked over his right shoulder to the water. He leaned over way too far and way too fast. Panicked hands gripped the armrest and flung his body back. Heavy heartbeats thumped in his chest and echoed in his temples as he counted the ways that he'd almost died. A damn tragedy indeed. Motivated to mind his center of gravity, he lowered his goggles to view the dark, shadowed waters, looking a second too late. He saw nothing but the fast-moving surf as waves sped past the ship. Perplexed, he sat upright, and again he heard a loud slap. Time seemed to slow as he waited. Determination fixed his stare, and after a dozen seconds, the source of the commotion revealed itself. Dolphins, longer than canoes, emerged from the water, superimposing their green glowing forms against the ocean's black surface. Giant green dolphins hovered over 4 feet in the air. From the top, they seemed to fly with the ship, remaining motionless for upward of 3 seconds until smacking the water's surface with a loud glunking. Green glowing streams of bubbles followed the descending dolphins, resembling diving torpedoes. Turbulence of the 1-ton mammals radiated in the agitation, and the trails faded as the dolphins dove deeper. It took a second for the event to register in Rusty's mind, and for a moment, nothing else in the universe existed. Wide eyes stared at dolphins performing acrobatics, surfing the stem's wake. He glanced at the rear of the ship, expecting witnesses, but he was alone. Alternating turns, dolphins leapt from the water and slapped back into the sea, diving deep into the black abyss. Dolphins jumped 20 feet across the surface. The ship cruised at 35 knots, but the pod maintained their pace with minimal effort. Many people have watched dolphins skim the bow of the ship, but this was different. Rusty experienced something few people on Earth had ever seen. Illuminated dolphins viewed through night vision goggles with blazing green bubbles. One after another, the dolphins jumped, hurtling like racers. They leaped and plunged, moving in long, repeating sin waves. In mid-flight, one dolphin twisted and corkscrewed to its left, locking stares with Rusty. Its black dot of an eyeball appeared in the viridescent, glowing froth. Night vision goggles amplified the phosphorescence created in the ocean water, highlighting its black bead. It was a tiny orb resembling a single raisin on glowing lime jello. As the frequency of the jumping decreased, the dolphin's acrobatics subsided. As quickly as it begun, the spectacle stopped. Saddened to be alone, Rusty continued looking at the water for much longer, hoping the dolphins would resume frolicking in the swells. But minutes went by with nothing. He sat upright and stared ahead, his head filled with the enchanted memories of the dolphins. Looking back at the horizon, he resumed his watch. Perhaps it was the unusual spectacle, or more than likely it was the intimate nature of the personal event, but the tiny electrical whales were among the most exciting thing Rusty had ever recalled seeing. It was a sight few people were privileged to see, and it was a scene nature seldom duplicated.